Boker Tov, Givrin. Ma Shlomchem. Oh, Scott Basolo says Tov Meod. So things are going well. We're going to begin this morning by going back to Psalm 103 and talking a little bit more about it. And then we're going to move to an oral translation of Genesis 37, verses 1 through 11, and a bit of a continued work on weak verbs. We'll look at the middle guttural verbs. And that's our class for today, those three things. So I start with Psalm 103. We're at verses 11 and 12. The first line of verse 11 is Ki Kig Vo'ach Shamayim Al Haaretz. Let me read it one more time and then repeat it after me. Ki Kig Vo'ach Shamayim Al Haaretz. Okay, everyone repeat it. Ki Kig Vo'ach Shamayim Al Haaretz. And the second line is Gavar Hasdo Al Yire'au. All right, that again, let me read it one more time, and then you can repeat after me. Gavar Hasdo Al Yire'au. Okay, everyone? Gavar Hasdo Al Yire'au. Now, if you're pronouncing it with a modern Hebrew inflection, for those of you who are Dr. Grisanti students and visiting this morning, you'd pronounce that last word Yire'av. All right, it'd be a V for the vowel on the end, using the modern Hebrew pronunciation. Now, in translating this verse 11, we begin with the key. And it has to be either the idea of because, or it will be used emphatically, indeed. And if we go back to the preceding verses and take a look at them, remember we had all these negatives. And we had that he will not contend forever. He will not refrain his anger forever. He does not deal with us according to our sins. And he does not reward us according to our iniquities. Now, since we have these emphatic declarations, the negation here, the saying the things God will not do with regard to our sins, then it is very likely then that as we approach then the next verse, that the key is giving the reason why he does not deal with us according to our sins, and he does not reward us according to our guilt or our iniquities. Because, literally as high, the kaf preposition on Gevoach. Gevoach is an adjective, means high, because as high, Shamayim, the heavens, Al Haaretz, the heavens above the earth. In other words, take this as high as the heavens above the earth, or it'll be higher than the heavens above the earth if it is a comparative concept. And we have to catch that in the next line, because thus far all we have is a prepositional phrase, which is normally adverbial and modifies either a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. And we do not have anything for it to modify yet in this sentence. So we have to move on to the second line, and here we have the verb, gavar. Gavar means he prevails, or it means he is higher, greater, a higher station, the idea of being supreme. This verb is characteristic of the flood narrative, where it talks about the waters prevailing above the earth, even above the mountaintops. And so as we read this then, would be here say that something is higher, again, or prevails more, or is above. And we have to find out whether that's God as the subject, third masculine singular, is the Cal perfect, third masculine singular, or something else. The next word is chasdo. Chasdo is from chesed. It says steadfast, loyal love. The third masculine singular pronominal suffix is there, the holam wow on the end. So it's his steadfast love. And so that would indicate then that that is the subject of gavar. His steadfast love prevails, or is high, al yire'au, above those who fear him. Yere'au is a cow participle, active participle, masculine plural, in a construct form with a third masculine singular pronominal suffix attached. And so it's those who are fearing him. And so here we would say that his loving kindness or his steadfast, loyal love prevails over those whom he loves. Those whom he those who fear him. Let's get it correctly here. Those who fear him. So looking by the context here, it'd be because his steadfast love is higher or prevails more than is higher above those who fear him than the heavens are above the earth. And the best way to convey that in translation is just to use a comparative as translation for the prepositional phrase instead of trying to make it comparative by more or higher. And just say, because as the heavens are above the earth, his steadfast loyalty prevails over those who fear him. Or you can say is higher or is above those who fear him. But I like the translation prevail here. And the concept of prevailing is the concept that it prevails over their sins and over their iniquities. So they are not dealt with according to their iniquities and their sins because of the fact that his steadfast love prevails over them. It's a very beautiful picture. And the accented word order with having the prepositional phrase first is not to be taken as any necessary exegetical significance, because anytime you have a key conjunction and a key clause, word order is out the window. Okay? Word order is out the window. That's same inside an share clause. In Muraoka, Takamitsu Muraoka's book on emphatic words in the Hebrew, when he did a survey and did the statistical analysis of key clauses, he concluded that word order interior to a key clause does not signify any degree of emphasis exegetically. It is quite normal to have something precede the verb that would normally be after the verb if it were exterior to a key clause. But inside the key clause, it's not necessarily exegetically significant. The only way it could be exegetically significant is by context. So that if we went on in this context, and if we had a second kaf used with the same type of meaning or focus, then the repetition would make it emphatic, not necessarily the word order. So we'd have to look to other factors for it to be emphatic. As we go further, that's exactly what we do have. We have another kaf phrase. Ki urahok mizrach mimma'erav. I'll read that one more time and you can repeat it after me. Kir hok, it's got a silent schwa under the resh. Kir hok mizrach mimma'erav. All right, everyone repeat it. Kir hok mizrach mimma'erav. All right. Then we have hirhik mimenu eth peshaenu. Let me read it one more time. And actually, by the way, we'll have to make this schwa here under the resh a vocal because of the metheg that is located to the left of the hirik under the hay. That's accenting and maintaining that syllable as an open syllable. That makes the schwa that follows it vocal. So it's he rahik mimenu eth peshaenu. All right, everyone repeat it after me. He rahik mimenu eth peshaenu. All right, to read this as distant. Rahok means to be distant, as distant from east from west. All right? Now here we're going to have a comparison because the min prepositions on on ma'erav is going to perhaps be that way, because it's as distant as, no, it's not going to be, excuse me. Not going to be comparative at all. As distant as east is from west. As distant as east is from west. I was trying to make it a comparative and it won't make it. So we have the same type of comparative clause as, without the degree of comparison. All right? And it, so as distant as east is from west, he makes distant, mimenu, from him. That's a third masculine singular pronominal suffix on min, on the min preposition. And the direct object of he makes distant is our transgressions. Our transgressions. Pesha means transgression or rebellion. And here it's in the plural, pesha'e. Notice the yod, the tsera yod, it's a masculine plural construct. The nu is first common plural pronominal suffix. Our transgressions. So as distant as east is from west, he makes distant from him our transgressions. So here by context we have a double kaf prepositional phrase, and in the second one it precedes the verb without a key clause. So by context we can say that the repetition of the kaf preposition then in verse 11 and verse 12 indicates a focus or an emphasis upon these comparative clauses. And so the focus is upon the comparison. It's on the relationship, the simile here of saying, all right, his steadfast love is as high as the heavens are above the earth. In other words, it's without limit. It's high. You can, even if you go up to the Space Telescope Hubble and you take a picture out into the distant universe, there is no end to it. Scientists are amazed. Every time they take a photograph outward from the space telescope and they change the focus on it, they change the range, they change the lens, or they do anything with it, they find no end to the stars out there. They find no boundary, no limitation. And that's the type of thing here. Without looking at it scientifically, it's just been stated simply as a fact that it's higher than the heavens above the earth. And of course, people reading this or hearing this before had no concept at all of how distant it is that the Hubble Space Telescope tells us. But comparatively speaking, relatively speaking, as they stand, they know the stars cannot be reached. And the stars, to the ancients, were viewed as those which were beyond the reach. And they even planned that if they could escape to the stars, they could escape God. And what did God say in response in the book of Obadiah? Even if they should, speaking of the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, even if they should escape to the stars, from there I'll cast them down. They can't escape me. I'm everywhere. I'm omnipresent. And so his steadfast, loyal love extends to such a degree, is so extensive, is so without limit, that it's as though it were like the heavens that are higher above the earth than what we can comprehend. And as distant as east is from west. Where do the two meet? Well, if you have no curvature to the universe, even if you did, you'd have to have double, at least, minimum, although you'd have to go, if you go on a circular circumference, you'd have to figure not the diameter of the circle, but the circumference of the circle for it to return. And so to get east to west and have them meet is, in our concept, virtually impossible. So therefore, he makes distant our transgressions, the psalmist says, from him, from God. He doesn't consider them. He casts them away from his presence. He removes them from his presence as far as the east is from the west. This hyperbole that is being used in both verse 11 and verse 12 is in order to focus on and emphasize the fact that he is a forgiving, a merciful, a steadfastly loyal and loving God. So much so that the transgressions, notice this is the third term being used, transgressions, pesha, sin, hata'ah, and iniquities, awon, are not considered by him. He forgives. And that takes us back to the beginning of the psalm where it talked about his forgiving sins. Nathan?
How do we know the manu, if it's from us or from him, because they're identical?
By context alone. Context alone.
American Standard says from us.
Yeah, and I would take it as from him instead. And as you said, it's identical in form. But I would take it as from him, because by context here, it's not talking about the removal of transgression from us, but talking about his attitude. So that'd be my preference. Okay? Now, let's look at this poetically. The key, we call this an anacrusis. It is a particle that is set out here ahead of the clause, and some have identified this as anacrusis because it can be taken emphatically as indeed, certainly, and it can fit, but as I said, if you look at the context, it can equally be taken as a causal. Even as a causal, it's considered anacrusis because it is a particle that begins the whole phrase. In fact, it begins even verse 12. It sets both of these verses apart. And if you were diagramming it, you'd have it separate out to the right-hand margin. And as you're looking at that, it sets the stage. It sets up the whole meaning and relationship of verses 11 and 12. And then as you look at these, you have the comparative A, B, C. And then in the second line, you continue on a progressive parallelism, because this is not a parallelism that's synonymous. And you have D, E, and F in going on. And then notice, the parallelism is not between the two lines of one verse, but parallelism is between the verses themselves. Verse 12 parallels verse 10. So A prime, B prime, C prime, the kaf preposition attached to the first modifier there, the adjective, and then having the two members of the distancing. And then in the next line, you have the D, the verb, and then you have the F, and here instead of having the direct object, chasdo, you have a prepositional phrase, and then the E is the direct object. And so the E and F have been reversed in order, because the prepositional phrase in verse 11 was al yire'au. Okay? So as we look at that and we see that change, that flipping of the E and F order, it lets us know that these two paired similes, comparative similes, are parallel to each other, and that from him is brought forward for some reason. Why would it be brought forward for any specific reason? Perhaps to say it means from him and not from us. Notice also there is a rebia over mimenu. That rebia, like over chasdo, is stopping the reading at that point. And some have suggested that here, instead of being a disjunctive accent, it should be treated as a topical accent, marking the key topic. Therefore, his steadfast loyalty is the key topic in the sentence in verse 11, and from him is the key topic in verse 12. And if that is to be parallel, notice you have a third masculine singular pronominal suffix on chasdo. That would argue again for a third masculine singular pronominal suffix on mimenu. If these are the key topics and the focus is upon God and upon his loving kindness, then it's making the transgressions distant from him, where he does not have to deal with them. And to be distant from him has to be very distant, right? Because he's omniscient. And he is what? Omnipresent. So that's a concept that is hyperbole to the extreme, but demonstrates that there's no possible way then that their transgressions, when God forgives them, are going to be held against them, because God blots them out of even his mind and existence. All right? Fantastic passage with a great truth that is quite emphatic, following up on and explaining the negatives of verses 9 and 10. Any questions before we move from here? Yes, Scott?
I'm just a little confused about the EF switching that's taking place and looking at the forms of those two lines.
Right. Here you have the direct object of the verb here. Here's the direct object of the verb there.
Okay.
This is a prepositional phrase here. This is the prepositional phrase here. They have flipped their order. Direct object, prepositional phrase instead of prepositional phrase, direct object. All right? Any other questions? All right. Well, we'll leave Psalm 103. I hope you're enjoying this. And keep in mind, those of you in my class at least, later in this semester we're going to be translating Psalm 103. So basically I'm walking you through it already. And it's going to be a matter of your taking good notes and your good memory and going back over this and studying it. And we'll be later having a vocab quiz on Psalm 103 also. Yes, James?
With the key preposition on the front, and you're saying it makes a comparison, do we always switch it around, like he makes distant from him our transgressions as distant as he is from us? Do we always flip-flop that?
No, we don't have to. In English, the order of the kaf prepositional phrases can be varied. We can put them before or after. So it's a matter of whether you want to preserve the exact order of the Hebrew in your translation here, which is possible in this case, or do you want to make it sound a little bit more smooth? So it's just a matter there of subjective choice. All right? Anyone else? Yes, Scott?
Read verse 11 for me one more time.
Yes, verse 11. Because as high as the heavens are above the earth, his steadfast love prevails over those who fear him. Now, there can be no measurement of his love. It's kind of like the song that was written by the composer who was in prison and who wrote it all on a wall. Oh, come on now. We just sang it this past Sunday and I'm drawing a blank. A song about the love of God, how deep, what's the title of that? How deep the love of God? Something of that's very close. You're all having the same mental block this morning at 7:45. All right? But that is a fantastic song. And the idea is that you cannot measure the love of God. It's beyond measure. It's beyond width, it's beyond breadth, it's beyond depth or height. And that's the idea here. And this is God's steadfast, loyal love with his covenanted people. This covenant relationship he has. And when he forgives sins, it's forgiven. All right? Okay. We'll come back to that another time. And before we go to the ion guttural verbs and talk about the middle gutturals, let's go to Genesis chapter 37 first and do some translation. Let me pull that up here. All right, we're in Genesis 37. Jeff, if I could have you please translate verse 1, but before you translate, please read it aloud in Hebrew.
Vayeshev Yaakov be'aretz Megure Avil
Avi, or if you pronounce it in modern Hebrew, it would be Aviv.
Ba'eretz.
Ba'eretz.
And I gotta mark my focuses at Then.
Okay, didn't get the last word. Canaan.
Oh, here it is. It's on the other line.
All right.
Canaan.
Yes.
Canaan.
Yes, Canaan.
Then he dwelt. Jacob dwelt in the land. Then you have what could be fear or terror or sojourning. His father. Then he dwelt in the land where his father sojourned, in the land of Canaan.
All right.
Of his father sojourning.
Okay, and notice it's plural, sojournings. It's a masculine plural construct with a tsere yod on the end. All right, now vayeshev, that's from yashav. Yashav, he sat, he dwelt, he resided, he took residence, and it is a kal, imperfect, third masculine singular, and it is a wayik tol form of the verb. Notice that the prefix yod then is there instead of the yod of the root. The yod of the root has disappeared. That's because it is an initial wow verb, as we found out in looking at it before. And so that accounts for its form with only two root letters showing, the sheen and the beith. Yaakov is the subject, proper name. We have a zakef katon above the kof that marks the quarter marker of the first half of the verse, the half point of the first half, which makes it a quarter of the verse. And ba'eretz, the preposition in, eretz, noun, feminine singular, land. It is in construct here by context. Migore is also in construct. And then we have aviv, the noun father, which is also in construct, singular, and a third masculine singular pronominal suffix attached to it, his father, of his father. All right, singular. Because the hirik yod happens to be the connecting vowel used in the construct of the singular of the noun av. For example, when you have the word Evimelech or Avimelech as a name, Abimelech, we say in English, Abimelech, Avimelech. It means father of the king. And it's that old construct form, the old genitive form that's a hirik yod. And so Jacob dwelt, and here you could say so, thus. It's the beginning of a section that is it's kind of like a heading here to the story of Joseph. It's a prelude to it. It is really concluding the previous in one sense because we're moving on to Joseph here. But the setting is Jacob settling down in the land of Canaan, and then we're going to pick up with Joseph inside the land of Canaan there. And it's the land of the sojournings of his father. So Jacob's father had sojourned in the land of Canaan. And we have Be'eretz Kenaan given to further specify that and to identify it as a appositional phrase. It's a appositional, prepositional phrase in apposition to the preceding three words. So the two Beith phrases are in apposition to each other. It's in the land of the sojournings of his father. That is understood to be explained as, that's what we call an epexegetical usage. It gives explanation, it's explanatory, the apposition here, in the land of Canaan. All right, any questions on verse 1? Scott.
On Megore, the place of residence, sojourning wasn't one of the translations that Holiday had.
Yeah, if you look under the root, gur, it means to sojourn. Okay. And the way it's used here is by context, the idea of not residing, because you have the contrast here of yashav as opposed to gur. And gur means to sojourn, to spend a brief amount of time in, to be a resident alien. And so it'd be better to use it as sojournings rather than to use it as residence of. It's not residences, and it's be plural, so sojournings fits that better. It's the idea of he wandered around. He lived in place after place, different places. Chad?
So the entry in Holiday that Scott is referring to, it does list this form, Megure, as the plural construct of Magor.
Yes, and it's from Magor, yes.
And one of the definitions it gives is stopover place, so that wouldn't really be the idea of residence, would it?
No, it would not. So if you stopped over places, that would fit sojournings. And notice there it goes on of a noun, ger, says see, meaning resident alien. And also talks about a protected alien citizenship. And and notice that home or place of residence in general is given for Job 18, verse 19. So I would keep the idea of the sojournings, the idea of stopovers, the idea of temporary residences here, not of permanent residence. Okay? And other questions on verse 1? All right. James Lee, verse 2, if you would read it out loud through. Let's not give you the whole thing here. Let's have you stop at Batson. All right? So read from the start down to Batson and stop there and translate that first section.
Toledot, Yaakov, Yosef, Ben, Sheva, Eshrei, Shana, Haya, Loech, Et, Echau, Batson.
All right, and then translate that for us, James.
These are the generations of Jacob, Joseph, the son of 17 years, was shepherding with his brothers among the sheep.
Okay, or among or in the flock. All right, excellent. These are the generations of, occurs 10 different times in the book of Genesis to divide it into various sections and parts. It is almost always used to precede a record rather than a follow, with perhaps one exception at Genesis chapter 2, where you have perhaps the conclusion of creation being referred to by the Eile Toledot there. These are the generations of Jacob. It's a noun clause, therefore we have to supply the word are, the form of the verb, the copula, to be. And then it goes on from there. It's as though you took put a colon at the end of that first sentence, or a period, and then continued on. Joseph, a son of 17 years. Now you can just use son of 17 years in the sense of a apposition. It's the idea of an idiom. When you want to talk about how old you are in Hebrew, you say you're a son of so many years. And so Joseph was 17 years of age is another legitimate way to translate it. Instead of translating the idiom literally from the Hebrew to say a son of 17 years, just say was 17 years old. You do the same with a woman or a girl. If you announce her age, you say the same thing, a son of so many years. And it's just an idiom, 17 years of age. Haya, cal, perfect third masculine singular. Ro'eh, cal, active participle, masculine singular, from ra'ah. This is what we call a periphrastic participle. It is the verb haya used together with the participle. That's a periphrastic participle. And the verb can be in the perfect or imperfect. There are cases of it being in the imperative and even itself being a participle. And then the participle can follow it or precede it. And it's a normal way of talking about something that is continuous and to focus on it being continuous. So it's the idea here that he wasn't at the present time shepherding the sheep with his brothers, but he was continuously. He was always. This was characteristic. It is something that he did continuously. He was continuously shepherding the sheep with his brothers. You can also take the beith on tson. Tson is flock, or you could say sheep. It can also be used of goats. And the pathak under the beith and the dogish in the tzadi tell you there's an article there. So it's among the sheep or in the flock. And another way to translate it is the beith could be introducing the direct object of ra'ah. So you could say he was shepherding the sheep or shepherding the flock with his brothers. You don't have to say in or among. The beith can be untranslated as identifying the direct object of the verb ra'ah. And you can find that out also by looking at holiday. And in holiday, as you look under the verb ra'ah and you go down through it, it should list there the idea that the Baith preposition can introduce the direct object. On number 3, under the cal, it says more generally tend, keep, flocks. Understood there's direct object. Notice it doesn't say among or in flocks. To shepherd, the accusative tson, but in Genesis 37:2, batson. So saying the same thing. This is the accusative. And so holiday would also take the baith here as just indicating the accusative of the verb ra'ah, and would just say shepherding the sheep or shepherding the flock. Eth, echau, obviously eth here is not a sign of the direct object. He's not shepherding his brothers. All right? He's not tending and feeding his brothers. It's with his brothers. So the eth here will be translated because in this context, it's clear that it is a preposition rather than the direct object marker. It's his brothers plural because remember, it would be a hierik under the cheth if it were singular, just like we had with avi in verse 1. When it becomes a plural, it normally switches to a pathak. But when you add the wow to it, then it becomes a comments. It's heightened because the wow, and this is part of the reason why I pronounce it with the biblical Hebrew pronunciation rather than using the modern Hebrew pronunciation, is because you can see the reasoning for it if you recognize the correct pronunciation, if I can be so bold as to say correct pronunciation. Of course, you know, I lived with Jacob, so I know how he said, how this was written, right? Yeah, some think I'm that old. All right, I'm really not. So when you're looking at it this way, remember that when we had, for example, if we have that could be my brother, but this would be my brothers. And if we add the wow for the third masculine singular, that extends all the way to a comments, because this that can become I when it's pathic and yod, when you have the wow added to it, becomes like an OW or an AU in some languages. And this is being treated as a vowel because it was a vowel originally. It was a holum wow. And so if you take ao, ao becomes ow very easily and readily in combining those two vowels. And so you take off the holum and leave this. You don't turn this into a consonant as in modern Hebrew. You leave it as a diphthong that forms a vowel. Just like when you have O and Y on boy, it's not taking this Y and making it a consonant. It is combining with the vowel letter, and it is lengthening the vowel sound. The same with may, you see. And the same with fa. The W is no longer a consonant. The Y is no longer a consonant, and that's the same thing we have here. It's the same type of behavior that we have. So in Mishnaic Hebrew, starting somewhere, sometime between the time of Christ, perhaps, as some would indicate, by means of using the transliterations in Greek of, say, Aquila's transliterations, and Origen in 230 AD in his Hexapla, where he gave a Greek transliteration of some of the Hebrew to where you'd see how it'd be pronounced. As you look at those things, it appears that even up to perhaps the 4th century or 5th century AD, it was still pronounced ow, but changed after that. And the best guess is that as the Jews spread throughout the world, especially those Jews that went into Europe, in the regions of Poland and Germany and even Russia, they were the ones who first began to change this to a V sound and make it a consonant again. And so that's the explanation of the differences in pronunciations as you look at that. All right?
Could you just give us that pronunciation of the biblical form of that?
Echau.
So
Echau.
it does pronounce.
Just like this.
Okay.
Echau. Ow.
So the yod almost becomes silent in
The yod is silent. The yod is silent, and so is the wow. There is no consonantal form there. The last consonant is the, in fact, the only consonant that has sound here is the cheth. Okay? All right. Any other questions on that first part? Okay, let's see here. Eric, I've already got you for translation. David, if you'll finish the verse, please. Read the Hebrew first and then translate.
I'd love to.
Oh, wait a minute. You translated before. I just saw your name down here. Excuse me. I just got you. You escaped. You escaped. Close. All right. But okay, Kelly, you're next. I haven't got your name down here.
Okay. All right. Ehu,
Wahoo.
Wahu, Nayar, Eth, Bene, Bilha, Wa'e, Bene, Zilpah, Meshe, Avi, Avil,
Avi.
Wa'e, Yosef, A, Dibtham,
Dibatham.
Raya, El, Avihem.
Evihem. Okay? And watch your segols that you don't make them all like Sares. Okay? All right, translate.
And he, and the yar escaped me, but I'm thinking with, and he was with.
No, not with. Na'ar.
Na'ar.
Have to go back to, I think, vocabulary quiz number. A young man.
Oh. And he, a young man, with the sons of Bilhah, and with the sons of Zilpah, wives of his father. And Joseph brought an evil word unto their father.
All right, good. Thank you very much. All right, and he was. Now, with the wow on a non-verb, you have to ask yourself the question, is this a disjunctive clause? To be a disjunctive clause, however, the writer has to have had a choice. He had to have a choice of putting it on a non-verb or on a verb. There is no verb here, so it's not a disjunctive clause. And it's just, and he was a lad, or was a young man, a youth, with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, or the wives of his father. Doesn't matter which way you translate it, it has the same meaning. Then we have the athnak, and that brings us to the logical middle of the verse. Because in the first half of the verse, logically, you have a description, identification of who Joseph is. He is obviously a descendant of Jacob, number one. Number two, he's 17 years of age. Number three, he is shepherding regularly with the flock with his brothers. And number four, he was a young man at the same time as the other sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, the wives of his father. So we have this multiple explanation of who he is in this first half of the verse, the first logical half of the verse. We have to supply, because you have noun clause here at the end that Kelly was translating, we have to supply the verb was. Or you have to say is, somehow you have to bring in a verb form of to be that will fit the context as you're translating here about who this individual is as you're talking about him. Interesting thing here, just a sidelight. There are very few places in Scripture where we pile up descriptives of an individual the way that we do here of Joseph. Go through the entire book of Genesis. You do not have this type of piling up of descriptives, of noun appositional clauses being used to describe an individual like this. It's very rare. One of the other places in all of Scripture this occurs is the description of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, where you have the same piling up of a large number of descriptors to help identify exactly who the individual is. So it's worth spending some time thinking about and deciding how much exegetical significance that has then, or expositional significance. It certainly is demonstrating the importance and significance of the individual, and that we have his identity nailed down. That's obvious. John?
Yeah, when it says that he was, with his brothers, does the with mean that they were youth with him, or that he was pastoring with them? Where is that tied together? I mean, I was assuming before he was pastoring with his brothers, and then while he's a youth, was just kind of thrown in there.
He was pasturing the flock. He was tending the flock with his brothers up through the Zakeph Katon there in the first half, where we had James finish. That is with his brothers. But now we're just talking about him being a lad, a young man. It has nothing to do with the pasturing of the flock or the feeding of the flock or the tending of the flock, because we're divided from that concept by the Zakeph Katon disjunctive accent.
I'm talking about as far as identifying what the brothers are doing.
It doesn't identify. The brothers are identified as pasturing with him in the first part of the verse that was translated by James. But the section that was just done by Kelly says nothing about pasturing or shepherding the flock. There's no verb.
Okay, but is it describing that they are youthful?
Yes, that's all it's saying, is he was a young man at the same time as they were young men.
Okay.
Okay? That's all it's saying. It's just a state of being. They were in the same state of being. And the state of being, the only thing said about it is Na'ar. And notice that Na'ar has a revia over it. And that's probably not to be taken as a quarter marker when you've just got Wahu Na'ar. It's probably a topical marker, saying this is the key topic, the key reference. And so the idea is that they were youths together. Okay? All right? Yes, James?
When we see a Zakeph Katon or the Afnak, are there normally, is that a place to put a punctuation every time, like a period, or how do we know when, I was trying to go through and divide it up, and I want to put periods there.
Yeah, you've got to avoid putting periods, and you will not always put punctuation in English wherever you have a disjunctive accent in the Hebrew. Sometimes it will not fit because it is a modifier of what precedes. But here, yes, you'd probably have a semicolon being used here to divide this off into its different parts. Okay? Yes?
With regards to Na'ar and the Revia, is there any exegetical significance to that? I mean, it seems like designating him as 17 years old and then using young almost implies an immaturity to it, as opposed to a young man, just he was young.
I don't think there's a sense here of immaturity. The fact that he's 17 years of age in the Hebrew culture means already that he's reached that age where he's considered to be a man and he's of marriageable age. And he could marry a girl as young as 12. And so there's, I don't think there's a sense of immaturity here at all. And Na'ar by itself is used in a broad range. For example, Absalom is called a Na'ar, even at his death. His father, David, refers to him as a Na'ar. Those around refer to him as Na'ar. And yet he is a father. He was married and he had children, but he's still called Na'ar. And so Na'ar is, the age sensitivity of it is probably anyone under the age of 30 could be referred to as a Na'ar. But I wouldn't think here it's an idea of immaturity.
It seems odd that they put the Revia over something that almost seems a restatement.
It's put over it so that you don't have the confusion that John was talking about. Because you're asking, okay, what does it mean? He was a lad together with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. What was he doing with them? What was he doing together with them as a lad? Well, the idea is he was a lad with them at the same time. And that's the reason the Revia is put over it, to tell you they're talking about their mutual youthfulness. They were young at the same time. Nathan?
I guess just in English, when we say someone's 17, we wouldn't necessarily, if we were writing something in English, we wouldn't necessarily say he was young as well. So what do you do with in Hebrew when it seems like in English it's just repetitive information?
It isn't really repetitive because it's defining that in his youth, I mean, how do you explain if you're going to say, if you're going down through here, and let's put it this way, okay, because both of you are having this question. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years of age. He was shepherding the flock with his brothers. Together with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, he was what? Young. It's not really repetitive to say it. It's because you've brought in other people you're trying to associate with him in that time of his life. And so it's just like saying, well, you know, when I went to grade school, I was 8 years old. But my friends, my boyhood friends were at that time. Now, why say boyhood after I've already said I was in 3rd grade? Because I identify that these were my boyhood friends, not the friends I still have today. And so it's to associate the cycle of those people. And so that's all that's being done here. Okay? Gus?
Also, could it be that the fact that Leah's kids are not mentioned, they were much older than his kids, because they were the first? Would that be something?
Yes, it's to identify where he falls in the family, yes. He's with the younger of the family. This extended family, remember, 2 handmaidens, 2 wives, 4 total bearing all of these children, and he was among the younger group. Okay, yes, Kenny?
I think for the confusion for me is that when you look at the other verse where it talks about Joseph being a son of his old age, I think that's where a lot of the confusion
Okay, we'll get to that later. We'll talk about what that means. Okay, yes?
So is this indicating that Leah's sons were not pasturing at this time, or just
No,
that they were
it's
not
not.
young?
No. Remember, it said he shepherded with his brothers, without qualification of who his brothers are, implying all his brothers. This is a separate statement being made. Okay, don't confuse the two. Don't confuse the two. They're 2 totally separate statements. He shepherded with his brothers, but he was a youth together with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. In other words, he was among the younger set of the brothers. He fell into the line of those who were with who had been born by Zilpah and Bilhah. He was in the younger group rather than the older group of brothers. But it's a separate statement. It's not saying the younger ones did the shepherding. The shepherding was done evidently by all the brothers, and we'll find that out later, because when he goes, he's to check on them, and it's all of them that he has to see. Let's go back here, and I see John Melcon saw that he was going to be next called upon here and didn't return. Very interesting. There he is. He just came in. We were talking about you, John. I just said that you saw you were next to be called on, so you didn't return. So we're going to call on you next, as you can tell now, for verse 3. If you would read it out loud in the Hebrew and then translate it for us, please.
Yisrael ahehav et Yosef mikal banal ki ben zukunim hu lo wa'asa lo kedonet Hassim.
All right, good. Okay.
And Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was to him a son of old age, and he made for him a robe of various colors.
Okay. Let's go through this. Thank you. Yisrael, notice the wow on a non-verb. Here the writer had a choice because ahav is a verb. He could have put the verb first. He did not. He chose to put Yisrael first. Therefore, it is a true disjunctive clause. as a disjunctive clause, it either expresses contrast or it is providing background information. In this case, it is providing background information. There's no contrast here. It's just providing background information. There's nothing here, a contrast of Israel with someone else, nor is there a contrast with his love as opposed to something else. It is merely the idea here that it is background information. It's help us to better understand the situation that has occurred and is going to occur. The situation of why there would be a bad report, an evil report that Joseph would give concerning his brothers, or why it is that his brothers would have difficulty in getting along with Joseph. And so this is an explanatory aside. It'd be like a parenthesis in a translation that would indicate this information. So Israel loved Joseph more than. The min on call is a comparative min. More than all his sons. The idea is all of his other sons. He loves them all more than all of them. And then it says because. This gives the reason why Israel loved Joseph so very much. Because Joseph was a son of Israel's old age. It's Israel's old age. All right? When you're an age when you think that you're too old to have children anymore and you suddenly have a child, oftentimes that child is a favorite child because it's kind of like symbolic of the last of your life, the last of your vitality, and it's something very special. And that's why then you have Israel reacting this way. Why he loves Joseph more than his sons, than all his sons, because Joseph was a son of the old age of Israel. Scott?
Is the son of his old age, is that definite or indefinite?
A son. There is no article.
And his old age does not make it definite?
No. Because notice that the his is not attached to zikunim as a pronominal suffix. Instead, it's separated and put on a lamed preposition at the end. And that is to avoid that third masculine singular pronominal suffix, making it definite. Okay? So it's a son of his old age. Yes?
Could it be a son of old age to him, or would you always put?
Be saying the same thing, basically. Have the same meaning. You could translate it either way. You could say he was for him a son of his old age, but still a son, no matter how you look at it. Okay? Now, the last part, after the athnak. Notice the athnak marks the logical middle. So explaining how or why he loved him so much is the first half, and the second half of this verse is showing the result of that love, is that he made for him, in other words, Israel made for Joseph, ketonet pasim. Pasim is not the idea of many colors. We have that myth in Christianity because of a translation in the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, that indicates that it was many colors. But pasim has the idea of an expensive garment, normally with long sleeves, and it was a long garment that did not stop at the knees or even just below the knees. It went all the way to the feet. It covered the feet. So it's a long, expensive garment, full sleeves, full length. Sometimes it was specially embroidered, but it was not the idea of many-colored. That many-colored concept is something that's imposed upon the text by an interpretation in the Latin Vulgate translation and has nothing to do with the meaning. You can find that out by going to other passages in the Old Testament where pasim is used and find out that it's interesting. Even the Latin Vulgate doesn't translate it many-colored in any of the other occurrences. So it's not a many-colored coat, in spite of all the things we have going on about Jacob, even the play, and all the different things that we've talked about, the songs and the children's Bible stories and the Bible story books. That's not the idea at all. It's not the idea of many colors. It's the idea, sorry, Dolly Parton, that you can't keep your song, a coat of many colors. Her mother may have made her a coat of many colors, but Israel didn't make a coat of many colors for Joseph. And it's just a long, flowing, expensive garment. It set him out differently. Now, the interesting thing here is ketonet. Ketonet is the idea of a garment that oftentimes is short-sleeved and also short. It's a short toga, to describe it in Roman terms. And it was that which is comfortable, was easy to wear, was modest, but was easy for men to wear especially because they could wear it at work and doing different things without having to gird up their loins. Because if they had a long robe, they'd have to pull the robe up out of their way and tuck it into their belt in order to move freely. But the ketonet could be worn at all times, and it was comfortable, especially in hot weather. It was comfortable because it's like wearing a dress, actually, wearing a dress that came down below the knee instead of coming all the way down to the feet. And then the sleeves were short, or sometimes you just cut off completely. And the arms were open, so it was easier to keep cool, and it was easier to do work. So that's part of the idea here. The ketonet pasim. Pasim is then describing a modification to the ketonet, and that modification is the long sleeves and longer garment. Question, Scott?
Yeah, when I looked that up, and I looked it up in Collins Brown or whatever it is too, but here in Holiday, it says ketonet hapasim, Genesis 37. And then it says tunic of pieces of various colors with a question mark. Mm-hmm. Are they picking up, is that kind of backwards because that became a popular idea and they're putting it in there as a possible translation because it became a popular translation? I mean, is that circular?
It's what they're doing. Notice this is not the translation. Right. Translation is always put in bold. So this is just a comment. A tunic of pieces of various colors, question. In other words, uncertain. And tunic reaching the ankles, question, uncertain. Now, the thing is that if you take a study of this in the cognate languages and you also take a look at the parallel cases here in 2 Samuel 13, you find out it has nothing to do with a tunic of many colors or many colored pieces. It's the idea of the reaching to the ankles or having long sleeves is the best way to look at it.
And I guess what I'm wanting help with is understanding how to use holiday. I mean,
okay, what your question is how do you translate it when you're using holiday? Right?
Well, that's the immediate question, but the bigger question is when we have all these comments and they're not in bold, how do we know when, okay, that one applies here? Right. I read that and it's like, well, that's my chapter. I found it, you know?
Yeah, you're thrilled to find it, right? Yeah, and I'm not going to count any points off if you have many colors, but I will circle it and put a question mark. You don't lose any points on something like that. The idea is, this is why you're taking Hebrew, is as we go through these examples and you run into them and I offer explanation, you learn to be judicious, careful, cautious about the use of translations in both Holiday and in Halot, the larger form.
So the bigger question is the one that you think I'm asking, which I am, but here specifically on this, why is this again just the humanness of this book? This guy's going, well, this has been out there, so I'm going to put it in as a question mark, and then I look at that, even with the question mark, and go, well, there must be some validity to that, or he wouldn't have put it in there at all.
There's no validity to it other than the Latin Vulgate.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay.
So you think all the major translations leave it in?
All the major translations leave it in because if you remove it, it is such a part of most churches and the way they teach and the teaching of their children. It's like if you mess with Psalm 23 or the Lord's Prayer, no one's going to buy your translation. You mess with a coat of many colors, many people have the exact same response. And it's because it's so ingrained traditionally. And so they leave it in that way. And if I were Kohler and Baumgartner, and if I were Holiday, I would not put that in there at all that way. I would put in that this is a long garment either to the ankles or long sleeves, question mark, and then in parenthesis I would put traditionally, on the basis of Latin Vulgate, a coat of many colors. But it would be a comment and explanation only. It would not be to offer it as a potential viewpoint that has any merit.
The word means to the palm, right?
To the palm, yes.
Where do you get the ankle part?
The ankle, remember the bottom of the feet, what do you call them? They're also called palms. Okay,
So
yes.
back to your original answer to my question, how do you find that in Holiday? I mean, it's not here.
Well, it does say reaching to the ankles as a second alternative viewpoint.
Okay, but that also has a question mark, so I mean, I guess
Right.
it,
So as far as translation, you choose one of these two and go with it based upon the degree, the amount of time you have to do individual research of it, and leave it to the professor to be gracious to allow either one and not to count off, and to instruct you on which is preferable, which is what you're doing. Okay? Yes, Scott?
Okay, now how do we preach it? I mean,
How do you preach it? If you're going to preach it, and if I'm in the audience, you better not be preaching it the many-colored coat. I'll do what Dr. Farnell said one day that he would do. He got up in front of chapel and was preaching a message, and then suddenly he sat down in a wheelchair that he had placed there, and he put a shawl over his legs, and he picked up a cane, and he said, "Gentlemen," he says, "if you violate this," he says, "even if I'm an old man sitting in your congregation at the far back, I will roll down the aisle and I will crack you across the knees with my cane." So gentlemen, that's what I too will do if you preach it as many-colored coat, all right? What you do in preaching is you explain to your people that that is not the meaning here, and that it is something that grew up around a misunderstanding of the verse and of the phraseology that is utilized, and that it's better to look at it as a longer, more expensive robe that was different than what was the normal garment. Okay? Does that answer your question?
yes.
All right, James? In the sentence in translating it, I would say a long robe, or a robe with sleeves, or a fancy robe with sleeves, or a fancy long robe. There's a variety of ways you can translate it. An expensive long garment. I mean, I would be careful about using robe, because the fact that robe in English has the idea of what you put over your pajamas. So I would avoid that. But I'd translate it as a garment of some kind that was expensive, or long-sleeved, or long flowing garment, or something of that nature. A variety of things, as long as you got that picture across. Okay? All right, anyone else? Okay, excellent. Well, we're going to stop right there this time. We'll come back to it on Thursday. For those of you in my class, and Dr. Grisanti, Lord willing, will be back for the other fellows at that time. Let's go to talking a little bit more about the weak verbs. When we're talking about our nomenclature system, remember, we're talking about ion gutturals is the same as two guttural. Two guttural. We have number 1, Roman numeral, used for the first letter in the root, the first root letter. The second root letter is Roman numeral 2. The third root letter is Roman numeral 3. Or use the paradigm that is used by the ancient Arab grammarians who first did the grammars of Hebrew. They used pa'al as the verb form for all their paradigms, and so that's where we get the names for the various stems. Nifal, pi'al, pu'al, hofal, hifil, hithpa'al are all from pa'al. And so then these are used so that the second root letter is designated the ayin root letter. The first is the pei root letter, and the last is the lamed root letter. So that you can call this type of verb either an ayin guttural or a two guttural. All right? So verbs like maher, he hastened. Maher is a ayin or second guttural verb. Bacher, he chose. Ga'al, he redeemed. Lachem, he fought. Sha'al, he asked. Barak, he blessed. Those are all middle guttural verbs, second guttural verbs, or ion guttural verbs. You'll have a list of some of these in your textbook on page 164 to show you the, it gives you a list that includes some of these and a few others that are even different, so you can get an idea. Notice the aleph, the hey, the cheth, the ayin, and the resh, all used in these. Pa'al itself is a second or ayin guttural verb. So what's the clue? How do we handle such verbs? The clue is to incorporate the peculiarities of the guttural. What are the three peculiarities of the guttural? Anyone? Refuse doubling dogish, number one. Prefer A-class vowels. Prefer compound schwa. So we can expect those three rules to come in play. Just offhand, where do you expect the largest change? You're thinking probably frequency there. What about the largest as far as what's characteristic within the verb stems? The doubling dogish in piel, pual, and hithpael. It's going to be rejected. When it's rejected, what happens? Compensation. How is compensation performed? Vowel change. The vowel before is heightened. It's lengthened. All right? So we can expect that right away. If you have the middle root letter affected, then it's going to affect especially PL, PUAL, and HITHPAEL stems, because that doubling dogish then is not going to appear. So that one clue for identification is going to be missing. Reject the doubling dogish then, number one. Barrick. Barrick is going to be a PL perfect, third masculine singular. We would expect something like Barrick. Remember, in the perfect, it has the same sound as the name. P-ale. Barrick. It'd be doubled. But because the middle letter is a guttural, it's going to be rejecting the doubling, and the preceding hirik is heightened to its seri, so it becomes Barrick. Barrick is a PL perfect, third masculine singular from the verb barak. Me and ta. Me and ta is from ma'an. Ma'an, mame, aleph, noon, root. The ta on the end tells you immediately that it is a perfect, because ta as a verb suffix occurs only in the perfect. It's second masculine singular in the perfect. So that tells you then that the mame, aleph, and noon are the three root letters. And as we look at it, we see a tsere under the mame. Right away, we know that's not like cow. But then we think, okay, if it were PL, it'd be mienta. And now it's without that, so it's because that hirik has been heightened to a tsere because the rejection of the dogish by the aleph. It's again a PL, perfect. Second masculine singular. Watith pa'aim. Pa'aim, as we look at it, it does not have a doubling dogish you would normally expect in the hithpa'el, but we know it's a hithpa'el. Why? The double tau. The tau there, the second tau tells you it's that tau in the hithpa'el. It's because we have a wow and a pathic and a dogish the next letter, we know it's a wayik tol. So since it's wayik tol, we know it's the imperfect. So the first tau is the prefix for the imperfect. So it is a wayik tol, it's a hithpa'el imperfect, second masculine singular or third feminine singular from pa'am. The pathak that would normally be under the pay there, because hithpa'el is a ah, because the rejection of the doubling dogish by the ayin and the heightening of the pathic to a comments. Tibarku, tibarku. Tibarku, first of all, as we're looking at it, we see it's an imperfect with a tau prefix. When you have a schwa under the prefix of an imperfect, that tells you it is normally going to be an intensive. It's going to be a PL or pual. And as we're looking at this one, it's going to turn out to be a piel, because in the piel you have a pathic under the first root letter in the imperfect, as opposed to the pual that has a kibbutz. And so this becomes a kametz, because the resh rejects the doubling dagish. So it's a piel, imperfect, second masculine plural, from Barrick. Sometimes compensation is ignored. Why? Well, it's a good guess by anyone to try to decide why. Why do we have language spoken the way we do? Why do some of you say aunt when I say aunt? You know, why do some of you say tomato and others say tomato? It's one of those peculiarities of language. Why did one choose it to pronounce it differently or one way as opposed to another? That's lost in the mists of antiquity. No one knows why certain things are done in language. We can't explain everything. And part of this, some have explained on the basis of context and certain sounds being overly dominant or causing confusion. In some cases, it's a matter of a difference in accentuation. Sometimes it's a difference because of being combined with another word nearby. In other cases, it's just totally unknown. And we have to just say, okay, it's a matter of euphony. It's just a matter of good sound, the preference of sound by the Masoretes and the traditional pronunciation they had received and then conveyed. So as we look at this, Yinnachem. Now we can explain this one partially, because remember, when we added the article to words that began with a cheth, we said the strong guttural can be doubled by implication, and therefore even though the doubling dagish is rejected, then you don't heighten the pathic of the article, definite article, because it's doubled by implication, so you don't have to compensate. So that could be true here with Yinnachem, that the cheth doubles by implication, therefore the pathic preceding it is not heightened. It is a piel, imperfect, third masculine singular, from Nachem. Ne'etz. Notice here, it did not go to ne'etz, like Barrick above. Why? We have absolutely no idea. All right? So you have to be alert to these things. It can change and it can remain without doing it. But you have to just be aware that it can and usually does. The same with bi'artim. The tim tells you right away that it's a perfect form of the verb, because the tim occurs on a perfect. It is the second masculine plural of a perfect. So the Beth, Ayin, Resh are the root letters, and as you look at it, the Ayin being a doubling, refusing the doubling dagish as a guttural, helps to explain why you retain the hirik under the Beth, and why do we retain the pathak under the Ayin? Why is the pathak under the ayin, and instead of like in pi'el having a tsere? Prefers A-class vowels. That's why we have the pathic in me'anta above as well. Uvi'atatu, as we look at this one, it can cause us lots of confusion, because actually we have it's a piel, perfect, third feminine singular, with a third masculine singular pronominal suffix that uses a tau instead of a nun. And this is found in 1 Samuel chapter 16. You saw it there, that the evil spirit harassed Saul. And here the hirik is not heightened, even though the ayin has rejected the doubling dagish. And part of the explanation being used here on this one is that you have a metheg that keeps the syllable open because it is followed by a compound schwa, because it prefers compound schwa. And the compound schwa that will be preferred is the A class, so you have a hatif pathic. And the normal rules, the preceding vowel will be the corresponding short vowel, it would be a pathak. But you can't have a pathak there, because that would jeopardize one of the key elements to identify the piel. You have to have an I or E class vowel. Well, it happens that in Hebrew, the I class vowel is nearer to the Pathak A-class vowel than the Tsere is. And to see that, you go back to the chart that we had earlier in our textbook and look at it. The one that's on, yep, find the right one here, on page 39, and you'll see that the short vowels, the I and E class vowel, the Hiric and Pathak, can shift back and forth with each other. Notice you don't have the large, doubled, heavy, dark line with that cell between the Pathak and the Hiric. Those two are so closely related in the way that the Hebrew vowel system develops that they often are exchanged one for the other. So in this case, there's no need to change it to the corresponding short Pathak because the Hiric is close enough and it allows the preservation of one of the key elements that help to identify it as being a Piel. Okay? So that chart on page 39 is the way to remember that about the Hiric and Pathak being so closely related to one another. And for those of you in Dr. Grisanti's class, I don't know if your textbook includes anything of that nature in its instruction. You'd have to search for it probably. But it's in ours. We put it in there. Okay. See, that's, get a better textbook in here. And also a good deal of prejudice. Prefer compound schwa. Hith na eri. Anyone want to take a guess at what that verb would be, parsing? Who has it? Raise your hand if you have it. Gus. Hith pael. Anything else you can tell us? Can you go further? Can you give us the full parsing?
It's perfect.
Okay, stop there. You're wrong. We won't let you go further yet. Jan.
Imperfect second.
Not an imperfect. Doesn't have an imperfect prefix. It has a hey. All right. So what's left, guys? Who's left? Anyone? What have you seen with a Hiric yod on the end of it? Imperatives. A feminine singular imperative, right? And that's what it is here. Remember, an imperative is formed by dropping the imperfect prefix in the second person. But if you do that in a hithpa'el, you're left with a tau. So to compensate for that, to make certain this can be recognized, you bring back the hey. You bring back the hey in the imperative. This is a hithpa'el imperative, feminine singular. Feminine singular. Remember, go back and think again about it. Yiktol, tiktol, tiktol, tiktali. Tiktali. Cal imperfect, second feminine singular. Tiktali. Kittali. Kittali. When you take off the tau. Kittali. And that's what we have here. Hith na'ari. All right. Rachatsu is going to be a piel, imperative, masculine, plural. That accounts for the Pathak under the resh. And then rachatsu, this is really interesting. This becomes a cal perfect third common plural. If it did not have the metheg, you'd have the potential of confusion. But here it makes certain that you don't confuse it and is clearly understood as a cal perfect third common plural. All right? Prefer A-class vowels, za'ak, etz'ak, and nicham. Za'ak, that's the cal imperative, masculine singular. It can also be what? Cal imperative masculine singular is identical in form with one other form of the verb. What is it? Formed the same way. Infinitive construct. Cal infinitive construct, cal imperative masculine singular. Etz'ak, cal imperfect first common singular. The aleph gives that away. And then nicham, oh boy, now we have lots of fun with that one. Because it is a pay noon verb as well. So this is a PL perfect. Third masculine singular from Naham. The doubling dogish is rejected. The chet prefers an A-class vowel instead of the tsere, and the hirik is retained. Otherwise, we move into other realms. We move into the realm of a nifal, perfect, third masculine singular. And in that case, you have another noon that's not assimilated and is rejected. You're bound to have here a confusion, because it is possible to have this form in the nifal, even though many would prefer to have it as neham with a tseri because of the extra amount of information that's involved. But it can form either one. Context will have to determine it.